The moment I received the message that my family had planned to hire me as the babysitter for 15 children at the wedding, a tight knot formed in my stomach, heavy and insistent, a weight that seemed to press on my chest and shoulders all at once, reminding me how long I had been carrying obligations and expectations that were never mine, obligations wrapped in family pride and tradition, obligations that had always demanded my quiet compliance. And in that instant I felt the spark of rebellion, a small but fierce flame that whispered I could say no, I could step away, I could carve out a space for myself even in the midst of chaos that everyone else seemed to accept as normal. And I knew that agreeing to babysit would mean spending the entire day tethered to screaming children, running between demands, wiping faces, bending to schedules that belonged to everyone else but me, and I could feel the familiar sinking feeling that always followed me when I was expected to put myself last, to vanish behind the busy, smiling mask my family always expected, and I decided I wouldn't do it, that I would make a plan of my own, quietly, secretly, without asking permission, without waiting for anyone's approval, because this time I wanted to feel some measure of control, some measure of freedom, no matter how small. And so I changed my plans, canceling the babysitting agreement in my mind and charting a different course, a path that took me not toward the chaos of children and domestic expectation, but toward the bright, humming energy of the wedding itself, where music, laughter, and the golden scent of flowers filled the air and threatened to make me feel alive again, even though a part of me still braced for the tension I knew was lurking beneath the celebration, a tension no one seemed to see, but that I could feel in the sharp glance exchanged between a cousin and an aunt, the stiff posture of my uncle who had always believed I should follow his rules, the way smiles curved too carefully on faces that hid irritation or jealousy or old grudges. And as I walked toward the venue, each step measured and deliberate, I could feel a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. Exhilaration because I had chosen myself, unease because I had no idea what storms I might awaken by stepping out of the role my family had assigned me. And the more I approached the entrance, the more I noticed details I had never paid attention to before. The table arrangements, perfectly aligned but strangely impersonal, the floral arrangements slightly wilting at the edges, the servants moving with efficient precision, and the guests already arriving in shimmering fabrics and polished shoes, their laughter like a soundtrack that couldn't drown out the silent tension that vibrated beneath the surface. And I realized that weddings were like that. Every smile, every toast, every carefully planned detail, designed to create the illusion of perfection while hiding the small fissures and cracks that threatened to fracture the whole carefully constructed scene. And I felt a chill run through me as I remembered past weddings, past events where family pride had overridden honesty, kindness, or decency. And I wondered how many of those smiles I saw now were genuine, how many were rehearsed performances meant to obscure truths that no one dared speak. And I found myself glancing at familiar faces, noting subtle shifts in posture, eyes flicking toward one another, as if checking on alliances, rivalries, and loyalties, while I felt the weight of my own decision settle fully in my chest, not just the relief of refusing babysitting, but the knowledge that I had quietly stepped into a space where I would be free to observe, to notice, to understand things no one else would see. And I felt the smallest thrill of anticipation, knowing that this day, though it began as an ordinary celebration, might reveal more than anyone expected, that the invisible dynamics of our family could surface in moments small or catastrophic, and that I would be here watching quietly, fully aware, fully present, fully myself. And that thought, fragile and daring as it was, sent a shiver of both fear and excitement through me, because freedom always came with risk, and choosing myself meant that I could not ignore the consequences of stepping out of the role everyone expected, of refusing to vanish behind smiles and obligations, of demanding even in small ways that my existence mattered beyond the convenience I provided to others. And I walked through the venue doors, feeling the cool air-conditioned air brush against my skin, the scent of polished wood and delicate flowers mixing with the faint perfume of guests already settled. And I could hear laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, the soft clink of glassware, the quiet but constant rhythm of music that made the space feel alive and celebratory. And I moved through it carefully, each step deliberate, eyes scanning, noticing, assessing. And I felt my pulse quicken as I realized that my presence here, unscheduled, unassigned, was already drawing subtle attention, curious glances from distant cousins, quiet murmurs from aunts and uncles, the faint tightening of a familiar uncle's jaw as he noticed I was not carrying a baby, not tidying up, not disappearing into the background as I usually did. And I realized that my decision, simple as it felt to me, had already begun to ripple outward. nudging old dynamics, upsetting the invisible balance, and I felt both exhilarated and tense because choosing myself had consequences, and consequences in my family were never simple or small. And then I saw him, the man everyone had been congratulating, the center of so much attention, the groom, moving through the room with practiced charm, laughter on his lips, shaking hands, collecting congratulations, and I felt a flicker of dread and anticipation because I remembered stories I had heard about his temper, his pride, his quickness to judge, and though everyone else saw a polished, charming exterior, I sensed undercurrents that no one wanted to acknowledge, tensions and secrets hidden under the surface of his confident smile. And I realized that this day, my day of choosing myself, was also a day when hidden truths could surface, when the fragile facade of perfection could be punctured, when what seemed like a celebration could turn into revelation, and I felt a shiver of both fear and resolve, because I would not let myself vanish this time. I would not hide, I would not submit. And as the first speeches began, as laughter and applause filled the room, I noticed every small glance, every slight gesture, every subtle shift in expression, noting alliances, jealousies, and resentments as clearly as if they were written across faces in bold letters. And I felt the satisfaction of awareness, the thrill of being present, fully conscious, fully awake, in a room where everyone else performed the roles assigned to them without noticing the underlying currents. And as the crowd shifted toward dinner, as tables were filled and seats claimed, I felt the warmth of quiet power settle over me, a small but undeniable assertion that I had claimed agency in a family that rarely allowed it, that I had chosen myself over expectation, that I would not disappear into service, that I would not vanish behind duty. And I could feel the subtle shift in the room as eyes caught mine and realized that I was not just another observer, that I was here, fully aware and present, and I knew that this day, which began with the ordinary expectation of babysitting 15 children, had become something entirely different, a test of courage, awareness, and agency, a stage where the invisible dynamics of family, power, jealousy, and pride could be seen, felt, and acknowledged. And I smiled faintly, quietly, savoring the subtle thrill of autonomy, knowing that choosing myself had opened a door to something deeper, more revealing, more necessary than I could yet fully understand. But the anticipation and quiet tension that flowed through me told me everything I needed to know. The day had only just begun, and every moment ahead would carry consequences, revelations, and perhaps, finally, truths that could no longer be ignored. As the music shifted into a slower rhythm, the chatter around me seemed to fade, leaving only the hum of awareness that pulsed through the room, the faint rustle of dresses, the soft clink of glassware, and the distant laughter that carried over the polished floors. But even in this serene, celebratory haze, I could feel the undercurrents of tension that seemed to weave themselves invisibly between tables and guests, a subtle energy of expectation, judgment, and competition, and my pulse quickened not from fear but from the acute clarity that came from choosing to be fully present, fully awake, no longer disappearing into background roles or obligations imposed by others. And as I moved slowly among the tables, observing quietly, I noted how the children, the very ones I had been expected to babysit, were scattered in small groups, some giggling nervously at the noise, others tugging at adults' hands, their voices rising and falling in a delicate, chaotic melody that reminded me of my own childhood, of moments I had spent trying to keep everyone happy while sacrificing my own sense of self. And I realized that even in the midst of the laughter, I could sense the invisible hierarchies, the subtle judgments, the quiet battles for attention, power, and recognition, and that awareness made me simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted, because seeing clearly also meant recognizing the weight of things I could not change, yet knowing I could at least preserve my own boundaries, my own autonomy, my own sense of control, however small, however fragile. And then I noticed her, a cousin who had always been competitive, always sharp with her words, standing slightly apart from the others, eyes tracking my movements with a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and perhaps envy, and I felt a flicker of amusement mixed with caution, because I knew that awareness alone was not enough. I would have to navigate the subtle currents of her attention, the potential traps hidden in polite conversation, the quiet barbs that masqueraded as compliments, all while maintaining the grace and composure that my family demanded yet rarely acknowledged. And I took a slow breath, letting the cool, conditioned air brush against my skin, grounding myself in the present moment, feeling the weight of freedom and choice pulsing in my veins. And as I walked past the table where the groom's closest friends had gathered, I caught a brief glimpse of him laughing, a hand on his mother's shoulder, the charm in his eyes carefully calibrated, but I noticed too the brief flicker of something darker beneath it, a micro-expression that betrayed frustration, impatience, perhaps irritation at the subtle independence I was displaying, and I realized that my mere presence, refusing to vanish into babysitting duties, was already shifting perceptions, challenging expectations, quietly asserting that I was not a passive observer, not a tool for convenience, but a participant, fully aware, fully present, and entirely human. And that thought sent a shiver of quiet triumph through me, tempered by the awareness that with visibility came risk, and that scrutiny often carried hidden consequences, hidden resentments, and subtle attacks that could strike when least expected. And I remembered past family events where small acts of defiance, small choices to prioritize oneself, had led to whispers, judgments, and calculated attempts to undermine confidence, and I wondered, with a mix of dread and anticipation, what subtle battles might unfold today, what unseen narratives might shift in response to my quiet assertion of agency. And yet the thought of disappearing again, of yielding my energy and presence to everyone else's expectations, felt unbearable, suffocating, a weight I could no longer tolerate, and I pressed forward, letting my awareness guide me, letting intuition dictate which conversations required my attention, which gestures needed acknowledgement, and which silent undercurrents demanded only observation, while around me the air shimmered with the muted tension of poised celebration, a tension that could explode into confrontation at the slightest provocation, and I felt my pulse quicken again, not from fear, but from the understanding that the day had become more than a simple wedding. It was a stage where hidden truths, long-held grudges, and invisible power dynamics would surface, and that I had already placed myself in the line of observation, fully conscious, fully awake, fully seen. And as I approached the refreshment table, I noticed another figure I had not anticipated, a distant aunt known for her quiet manipulation, her subtle ability to steer perception without speaking directly, her eyes scanning the crowd as if measuring everyone's value, and I felt the subtle tension of awareness tighten, recognizing the unspoken calculation taking place, the silent judgments being assigned to my actions, and I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to maintain composure, to move deliberately, knowing that each action, each glance, each measured step could shift the balance of perception in my favor, or provoke the scrutiny I had long learned to anticipate and navigate. And I found a quiet corner, a vantage point where I could watch, unobtrusive yet fully engaged, feeling the rhythm of the event, the unspoken power struggles, the subtle alliances, the quiet rivalries, all moving beneath the polished smiles and sparkling glasses. And I thought of the children again, the ones I had been expected to corral, and I felt a mixture of relief and validation, relief that I had refused, and validation that I could observe rather than serve, could witness rather than labor, could learn rather than disappear. And as the ceremony continued, as laughter and music intertwined with the soft rustle of dresses and the faint scent of flowers, I noticed the first real tension of the day surfacing, a whispered exchange between two relatives that drew subtle, careful glances from nearby guests, the kind of quiet maneuvering I had only just begun to recognize, and I felt my heartbeat quicken, not in fear, but in anticipation of revelation, because I knew that moments like these, small as they appeared, carried the potential to unravel the careful performances everyone maintained, to reveal hidden resentments, jealousies, and secrets that had been carefully hidden behind tradition, smiles, and obligation. And I leaned slightly forward, observing every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture, every fleeting glance, storing it in memory, feeling the thrill of quiet power that comes from full awareness, while the children continued their games across the hall, laughing and oblivious, their innocence untouched by the silent calculations swirling around the adults. And I felt a pang of protective instinct, remembering the weight of responsibility I had often carried as a child, forced to navigate the expectations of adults while keeping my own feelings invisible. And I realized that by refusing babysitting duties, by claiming space for myself, I was reclaiming not just a single day, but fragments of autonomy, freedom, and self-possession that had been denied to me for too long. And that understanding settled in my chest like a quiet, insistent drumbeat, steady and unshakable. And as I watched the subtle ripples of tension continue to flow, I noticed another movement across the room, a distant cousin shifting nervously, casting furtive glances toward my direction, and I realized that my quiet choice to step out of expected labor had already begun to unsettle some, to provoke curiosity, perhaps envy, perhaps anxiety, and I felt a flicker of both satisfaction and caution, knowing that asserting presence always comes at a price, yet feeling an undeniable thrill that for once, I was the architect of my own movement, my own attention, my own engagement, and I let myself breathe fully, letting the tension coexist with exhilaration, letting the subtle thrill of autonomy pulse through me. As the music shifted again, voices raised in celebration, laughter rippling across the polished floors, and I felt a quiet certainty settle, that by stepping away from expectation, by refusing to disappear into service, I had claimed a space that was mine alone, and in claiming it, I had positioned myself to witness, to understand, to navigate the hidden narratives swirling around the hall, the invisible power plays, the small gestures loaded with meaning. And I knew that today, though it had begun with the ordinary expectation of babysitting 15 children, had become a test, a lesson, a revelation, and a stage upon which truths could surface, alliances could shift, and hidden stories could finally breathe. And I felt a deep, steady resolve that I would not retreat, not vanish, not bow under expectation, but would remain present, aware, vigilant, and fully myself, fully awake, fully human, ready to navigate every subtle current and every unfolding revelation that this seemingly ordinary wedding day had become. As the air around me shimmered with possibility, tension, and the quiet thrill of autonomy realized, and I knew with that steady pulse of awareness, that the story of this day, my story, was only beginning, and the consequences of my choice would ripple far beyond the laughter, the music, and the polished floors, shaping not just how the family saw me, but how I saw myself, finally, fully, irrevocably. By mid-afternoon, the energy in the hall had shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the polished laughter and carefully curated appearances had begun to peel away, revealing glimpses of tension that had always lingered beneath the surface. And I could feel it in every glance, every carefully measured movement, every slight pause in conversation, the way whispers fluttered like small birds between tables, delicate, tentative, but carrying weight, secrets, judgments, and silent resentments. And I moved through the room with careful attention, my senses alert, every detail magnified by the awareness that I had chosen to step away from expectations. And that choice had made me visible, fully seen for the first time in years, not merely as a background figure fulfilling obligations, but as someone whose presence carried weight simply because I refused to vanish. And I noticed how certain relatives subtly shifted in response, their expressions flickering as if realizing I was no longer a passive participant. And I felt the quiet thrill of power in that awareness, tempered by the realization that visibility always came with consequence, that attention, even respectful or curious attention, could carry judgment, scrutiny, or challenge. And I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to center myself, to allow the thrill of autonomy to coexist with the tension. As I walked past the tables and observed the children, now scattered, their laughter loud, unrestrained, ringing across the hall, like notes of freedom, the very sound that had once been my responsibility, that I had been asked to contain, control, and manage. And I felt a wave of relief wash over me, tinged with guilt, because the absence of that burden reminded me of how long I had carried it, and how rarely anyone had acknowledged the weight. And I realized too that while I had freed myself from the obligation, I was now free to notice the dynamics unfolding, the subtle rivalries, the quiet manipulations, the undercurrents of jealousy and alliance that threaded through the family like invisible cords. And I observed a pair of cousins seated at a corner table, their conversation low but intense, their eyes flicking toward the center of the hall where the bride and groom held court. And I sensed a calculation, a weighing of influence, a silent negotiation of position, and it fascinated me, the way people moved in invisible hierarchies, performing roles they did not question, adhering to rules they had never written. And I felt the quiet satisfaction of observing without interference, of seeing the machinery of family power operate while I remained untethered, untouchable, aware, fully awake, fully myself. And as I scanned the room further, I noticed another layer of subtle tension. The host's deliberate gestures, the careful positioning of family members for photographs, the quiet adjustments of clothing, hair, posture, all meant to convey perfection, harmony, and control. And I recognized the invisible narrative being constructed, the story they wanted everyone to see, and contrasted it with the reality, the minor frictions, the small anxieties, the hidden judgments. And I felt a shiver of exhilaration mixed with apprehension, knowing that awareness could be a double-edged sword, that to see clearly was to carry responsibility for understanding the full picture. And as I moved closer to the center of the hall, I saw her, my younger cousin, a girl who had always been competitive, always subtly critical, her eyes narrowing slightly as they caught mine, a flicker of recognition passing across her features, an acknowledgement that I was no longer performing the expected role, that my quiet autonomy was visible, and I felt a ripple of satisfaction, a quiet triumph tempered by caution, because I knew she could mobilize subtle judgments, indirect attacks, whispered criticisms, all carefully disguised beneath politeness and family etiquette, and I reminded myself to breathe, to hold space, to remain steady while observing, noticing, calculating, because this day, though outwardly ordinary, had already become a landscape of subtle power shifts, tests of patience, and assessments of influence, and I was at the center simply by existing as myself, unbound by obligations I had chosen to reject. And then the music changed again, slow and melodic, a tune that carried a melancholy undercurrent beneath the celebratory notes, and I watched as the bride and groom swayed in. Rhythm, laughter, and applause rippling through the room, and I could see the smallest micro-expressions. The fleeting glance of doubt in the groom's eyes as he noticed his mother's attention shifting elsewhere, the tension in the shoulders of relatives who had silently competed for influence, the subtle flicker of curiosity in younger cousins who sensed drama but did not yet understand it, and I realized that by refusing to disappear into service, by stepping into observation and awareness, I had positioned myself in a vantage point that offered clarity, insight, and quiet power, and I felt a thrill that pulsed through my chest like electricity, tempered by the recognition that it would not be simple, that visibility would attract scrutiny, that presence carried consequences, and that the day ahead would test patience, courage, and intuition. And yet, as I watched the patterns of interaction unfold, I felt a growing sense of anticipation, a knowing that the small cracks in the polished exterior of celebration would widen, that hidden narratives would emerge, and that what seemed ordinary would reveal itself as extraordinary in its quiet intensity, and I was ready to witness it all, to navigate the currents with precision, to remain fully present, fully aware, fully alive, as the undercurrents of rivalry, jealousy, manipulation, and hidden truth threaded their way through the celebration, and I noted too the subtle ways the children's laughter, unchecked and free, seemed to highlight the contrast between innocence and orchestrated performance, a reminder of all the expectations, burdens, and constraints placed on adults under the guise of propriety, and I felt a wave of empathy mixed with relief, recognizing both my own past entanglements and the freedom I had claimed in stepping aside, and I understood that freedom was both a gift and a responsibility. The ability to see clearly meant the need to act wisely, to move carefully, to observe without being manipulated, and to maintain a sense of equilibrium while storms brewed around me. And as the afternoon stretched toward evening, as music and conversation ebbed and flowed, I felt the weight of the day settle in my chest, a mixture of anticipation, exhilaration, and quiet anxiety, the knowledge that I had chosen autonomy over obligation, that I had claimed presence over invisibility, that I was awake in a room of performance, calculation, and invisible tension, and that awareness itself had become my power, my shield, my tool, my lens, and I breathed slowly, feeling the pulse of life, freedom, and observation flowing through me, knowing that whatever unfolded next, confrontations, revelations, alliances, or subtle shifts, I would meet it fully aware, fully awake, fully myself, and the quiet thrill of that presence, that agency, that reclamation of self, pulsed like a heartbeat in the center of my chest, steady, unshakable. And as the golden light of late afternoon filtered through the tall windows, casting warmth over polished floors and fabric, I realized that this day, though it began with the ordinary expectation of babysitting 15 children, had transformed into a stage where truth, observation, courage, and autonomy would play out, and I was ready to see every ripple, every subtle movement, every concealed gesture, every hidden intention fully present, fully awake, fully alive. As the evening shadows stretched across the polished floors of the hall, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that were subtle yet impossible to ignore, a quiet tightening in the air that carried the weight of anticipation, tension, and unspoken expectations, and I could feel it in the way a servant adjusted the placement of a chair with a little too much care, the way a cousin's laughter lingered longer than necessary before fading into silence, the way the mother of the bride's eyes swept across the room, resting briefly on each guest as if measuring their significance, their loyalty, their potential to uphold the illusion of perfection that the family had carefully constructed for this day, and I moved through the hall with deliberate awareness, feeling the thrill and pressure of full presence, fully conscious of each glance, each subtle gesture, each shifting dynamic, the way power circulated invisibly yet palpably among the adults, and I realized how far I had come from the girl who would quietly disappear behind chores, responsibilities, and the invisible weight of family expectation, now standing in a room filled with people who believed they controlled perception while I observed with unflinching clarity, noticing the small fissures in decorum, the hidden calculations, the quiet assessments, and I felt a shiver of exhilaration run through me, because seeing clearly was not merely an act of observation, it was an act of reclamation, a quiet declaration that I was present, that I mattered, that I would not vanish, that my autonomy had weight. And as I glanced toward the corner where a group of younger cousins had gathered, their expressions tight with whispered gossip and competitive glances, I could almost see the mental calculations being made, the subtle hierarchy being enforced, and I felt a pang of recognition because these patterns were familiar, they had followed me all my life, and yet now I was outside of them, untethered, able to watch and analyze without being ensnared, and that perspective was intoxicating, empowering, and fraught with responsibility, because to witness was also to acknowledge, and acknowledgement could provoke reactions, small or large, subtle or overt, and I braced myself with steady breaths, letting the cool air brush against my skin, letting the thrill of presence coexist with the underlying tension, the awareness that every movement, every glance, every measured step could shift perceptions, provoke curiosity, or trigger envy. And then I noticed her, the cousin whose quiet rivalry had always been sharpest, her eyes flicking toward me with something between surprise and calculation, and I realized in that moment that my presence alone was already destabilizing her narrative, that my refusal to conform to expectation, my quiet independence, was registering, influencing the subtle currents of interaction that had previously gone unnoticed, and I allowed myself a small, private smile tempered by caution, because visibility had consequences, and the consequences today were unfolding in whispers, microexpressions, and tentative gestures, and I observed a small gathering near the refreshment table, their conversation low but filled with nuance, each word carrying weight, each gesture loaded with subtext, and I noticed how the children had now begun to cluster near the edges, their laughter punctuating the calculated calm of the adults, reminding me of freedom and innocence, and I felt both relief and wistfulness, remembering moments when my own childhood had been tethered to service, obligation, and the invisible labor of maintaining appearances, and I realized that refusing to babysit had not only freed me physically, it had liberated my awareness, allowing me to navigate, observe, and analyze in a way that had once been impossible. And as the evening continued, the subtle cracks in the polished facade began to widen, small slights, fleeting tensions, brief flickers of irritation or jealousy, all magnified by my careful observation, and I understood that the day was unfolding as a tapestry of human behavior, stitched together with politeness, expectation, competition, and hidden truth, and that my role as observer, untethered by obligation, gave me a vantage point others lacked, a clarity that was as thrilling as it was fragile, and I felt my chest tighten with the intensity of awareness, the weight of witnessing, the quiet thrill of autonomy. And then I saw him again, the groom, moving across the room with effortless charm, his smile perfectly timed, his posture immaculate, yet in the briefest flicker of an expression, a shadow of frustration passed across his features, a momentary glimpse of impatience, perhaps irritation at the unexpected independence I displayed, and I noted it without flinching, cataloging it, understanding it, feeling the ripple of tension it created in the room, the subtle recalibration of alliances and attention, and I realized that today my quiet choice to step away from expected duties was already influencing the invisible hierarchy of the gathering, subtly, quietly, profoundly, and I felt a thrill pulse through me, a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension, because autonomy had consequences, visibility had consequences, and every decision, even small, could shift dynamics in unexpected ways. And then the music changed again, a slow, melodic tune that seemed to echo the hidden rhythm of tension beneath celebration, and I watched as the bride and groom swayed in time, laughter and applause echoing across polished floors, and I could see the fleeting micro-expressions. A cousin's hesitation before offering a toast, a whispered consultation between aunts, a quick glance of judgment masked with politeness, and I recognized the careful dance of human behavior, the orchestration of perception and reality, and I felt a pulse of exhilaration at being able to read the room, to see clearly what others could not, to navigate the currents with quiet awareness. and as I stepped slightly aside to observe a cluster of relatives whispering, I noticed the smallest of gestures, subtle movements of hands, the barely perceptible shifts in posture, the fleeting expressions that revealed alliances, envy, or suspicion, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing what had always been hidden, in claiming my own space, my own perspective, my own story within a room that had always demanded conformity, invisibility, compliance, and in that moment I realized that stepping away from babysitting duties had become a symbolic act, a declaration of presence, a subtle assertion of agency that reverberated more widely than I had expected, and I allowed myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, fully, savoring the thrill of awareness, the quiet thrill of observing, the electric pulse of freedom, and yet I remained alert, knowing that visibility could provoke challenges and that every ripple of recognition could shift subtle power structures in ways I might need to respond to. And I noticed too how the children, now laughing, chasing one another in small arcs of freedom, highlighted the contrast between innocence and the orchestrated performance of the adults, a reminder of the world I had once inhabited and a reminder of the freedom I had claimed for myself. And I felt a deep, steady pulse of validation, pride, and anticipation, because the day had become not just a wedding, not just a celebration, but a field of observation, of awareness, of human dynamics laid bare, and I was fully present, fully awake, fully myself, ready to witness, ready to navigate, ready to claim every subtle revelation that unfolded, knowing that each moment carried potential for understanding, for revelation, for insight. And as the evening shadows deepened, casting warm golden highlights across fabric and polished wood, I felt the quiet intensity of presence, the thrill of autonomy, the steady heartbeat of observation, and I knew that this day, ordinary in appearance, had become extraordinary in experience, and I would meet it, fully awake, fully aware, fully alive. The night deepened, folding the wedding hall in a golden glow of chandeliers and candlelight, and I could feel the subtle shift in energy, a quiet tightening that threaded through the conversations, the gestures, the carefully curated performances of civility, and I realized that the deeper the evening progressed, the more the invisible currents of tension became visible to those who paid attention, and I did, acutely, fully, noting the smallest flickers of impatience, the briefest glances of judgment, the imperceptible adjustments of posture that revealed thought processes, alliances, quiet rivalries, and concealed resentment. And I felt the thrill of presence, the quiet intoxication of awareness, tempered by the knowledge that being fully seen, fully awake, fully aware, came with subtle risks, because in a room filled with people invested in appearances, autonomy and visibility often attracted scrutiny, assessment, and quiet opposition, and I moved slowly among the tables, savoring the freedom of movement I had claimed, the liberation from the expected babysitting duties, noting how the children now wandered in small groups, unburdened, their laughter a delicate counterpoint to the calculated calm of the adults, a reminder of innocence, freedom, and the weight I had long carried as one expected to maintain order for everyone else. And I remembered, with a mixture of relief and melancholy, the years when I had bent myself into invisible shapes to satisfy family expectations, never allowed to claim presence, autonomy, or attention, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by lingering tension, because the act of observing now, fully awake, fully present, was simultaneously liberating and charged, a balancing act of awareness, judgment, and emotional acuity. And I noticed her again, the cousin whose subtle competitiveness had always shadowed me, seated across the room, eyes flicking toward me with that sharp, calculating curiosity, a micro-expression of intrigue and possible envy. And I felt the pulse of quiet triumph, tempered with caution, because visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny carried consequences. And I reminded myself to maintain grace, calmness, and composure, allowing observation to coexist with intuition, anticipation, and subtle influence. And I saw the groom again, moving through the hall with practiced charm, his hand resting lightly on his mother's shoulder, his smile perfectly timed, his laughter echoing, but I caught in the briefest flicker of expression the tension, the irritation, perhaps the faint realization that my quiet autonomy, my refusal to vanish into assigned duties, was quietly asserting itself in the dynamics of the room, shifting attention, subtly influencing perception, and I felt a thrill pulse through me, tempered by awareness that power and observation were interlinked, that being fully awake in a space of performance carried responsibility. And I watched as conversations shifted, as subtle gestures were recalibrated, as micro-expressions flickered like tiny flames across faces that outwardly smiled, and I realized that even small choices, refusing to babysit, moving deliberately, holding my gaze, occupying space without apology, were rippling outward, subtly altering perception and influencing the invisible hierarchy of attention, and I felt a deep, steady pulse of validation, a quiet exhilaration in claiming presence, autonomy, and the right to be seen fully, wholly as myself. And yet, even as I savored this sense of agency, I remained alert, sensing the invisible tensions as they gathered, the quiet murmurs, the brief exchanges of glances, the subtle adjustments of speech and gesture, all loaded with meaning, all a dance of human behavior I had only begun to understand, and I felt both thrill and tension coexisting, awareness as exhilaration and vigilance, observation as liberation and responsibility, and I reminded myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, to maintain the equilibrium of presence while storms of subtle scrutiny and judgment swirled around me. And then I saw it, a movement that almost escaped notice, a small gesture of friction between two relatives, a near imperceptible tightening of a hand on a glass, a fleeting glance that carried judgment, and I realized with clarity that the evening, though celebratory, was a minefield of emotional and social navigation, and my choice to claim autonomy placed me squarely in the center of observation and potential challenge. And I felt a pulse of adrenaline, quiet but insistent, reminding me that freedom always carried consequence, and I felt alive in a way that years of invisibility had never allowed, fully awake, fully aware, fully engaged. And as I continued to watch, I noticed the smallest of children running past, laughing, oblivious to tension, and I felt the sharp contrast between innocence and orchestrated adult performance, the reminder of what I had been expected to manage, and the exhilaration of reclaiming freedom, observation, and self-presence. And the realization settled that I was no longer subject to expectation, no longer tethered to service, no longer hidden, and that autonomy, even small and deliberate, had immense weight. And I observed the subtle recalibrations in the room as my presence was acknowledged, consciously or unconsciously, by those around me. The faint flickers of surprise, the brief assessments, the subtle shifts in posture, tone, and eye contact, all part of the unspoken choreography of family, power, and attention. And I felt a thrill, a quiet but persistent pulse of satisfaction, tempered by awareness of fragility, because to claim visibility was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny carried potential friction, and I reminded myself to remain composed, steady, and aware, allowing observation to coexist with insight, intuition, and careful calculation. And then a new movement captured my attention, a relative whose smile always masked calculation, now subtly repositioning themselves, perhaps to observe me more closely, and I felt the weight of awareness press into my chest, the knowledge that being awake, present, and autonomous was powerful, visible, and provocative, even in a room where appearances reigned. And I let a quiet, private smile pass over my lips, acknowledging the thrill of claiming space, claiming presence, claiming life, fully awake, fully alive, fully aware. And the tension continued to pulse, a quiet undercurrent beneath laughter, music, and celebration. And I knew the evening would unfold further, revealing more subtle truths, more hidden judgments, more glimpses of human dynamics and power, all under the guise of celebration, all waiting for those willing to observe carefully. And I breathed slowly, deliberately, letting awareness pulse through me, steady and insistent, letting the thrill of autonomy coexist with tension, anticipation, and vigilance. And I felt a quiet certainty settle, a deep, steady understanding that the evening was no longer merely a wedding, no longer a chore or an obligation, no longer a stage for the performance of others, but a landscape of observation, insight, agency, and subtle influence. And that by choosing presence over disappearance, by claiming autonomy over expectation, by observing fully, I had positioned myself not only to witness, but to navigate, to understand, and perhaps, in ways small but significant, to influence the currents that moved invisibly around me. And that pulse, that quiet but insistent thrill of awareness and freedom, surged through me as the evening deepened, music and conversation blending into a backdrop for subtle social maneuvering, for hidden judgments, for quiet calculations. And I knew that the story of this night, the invisible currents, and the choices I had made would echo beyond the polished floors, the laughter, the music, and the glowing lights. And I breathed deeply, feeling the steady rhythm of autonomy, awareness, and presence, fully awake, fully alive, fully myself. The night had fully claimed the hall, a soft amber glow spilling over polished floors and carefully arranged decorations, and the air seemed to thrum with a quiet intensity, the subtle tension that had been building all evening now almost tangible, a delicate weight pressing on the edges of every conversation, every gesture, every smile, and I moved through it fully awake, fully aware, each breath measured, each step deliberate, savoring the quiet power of presence, the thrill of being observed, yet unbound. And I noticed the smallest shifts in expression around me. A cousin whose smile never reached her eyes, a distant relative adjusting posture as if to measure my influence, a whisper of disapproval or curiosity that rippled briefly before vanishing beneath the orchestrated harmony of celebration, and I felt the pulse of autonomy surge through me, a mixture of exhilaration and vigilance, because to claim space, to be fully awake, fully present, was to exist visibly in a room designed to contain, to dictate, to invisibilize, and yet here I was, moving with intention, observing without intrusion, fully alive, fully conscious of every microexpression, every subtle glance, every flicker of judgment, every hidden calculation, and I realized with a steady heartbeat that the evening had become more than a wedding, more than an obligation, more than a spectacle. It had become a mirror, a stage for subtle truths, human dynamics, and the quiet, powerful assertion of self, and I savored it, even as caution threaded its way through my exhilaration, because visibility always attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny carried consequences, and I knew that some were already recalibrating their perception of me, measuring my choices, testing the boundaries of my independence, and I felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with quiet triumph, because to exist fully, autonomously, was a radical act, a quiet rebellion against expectation, a reclamation of power that had always been mine, even when denied. And I saw the children now, scattered in small groups, laughter rising, ringing across the room, their innocence a sharp contrast to the subtle, deliberate performances of the adults, and I felt a surge of empathy, remembering the years when I had carried responsibilities that were not mine, managing the expectations of others while sacrificing presence, autonomy, and the quiet integrity of attention, and now, by refusing, by stepping away, by observing, I had reclaimed not only a moment but a space, a presence, and the freedom to fully exist, to witness, to navigate, to reflect, fully awake, fully alive, fully myself. And as I moved toward the center of the room, the bride and groom now swaying gently to a slower tune, I could see the faint micro-expressions flicker across faces, tiny betrayals of thought, tiny sparks of judgment, subtle recalibrations of posture and tone, and I catalogued each quietly, storing them in memory, savoring the thrill of observation, the intoxicating awareness that I could see what others could not. And yet, as exhilaration pulsed through me, I remained conscious of the delicate balance, knowing that each glance, each movement, each assertion of presence carried subtle consequences, unseen, yet potentially significant, and I felt the pulse of anticipation thrum through my chest, steady and insistent, as the evening's rhythm shifted, the music softening, conversation quieting slightly, and the golden light catching the smallest details. A fold in fabric, a flicker of eye contact, a hand brushing against a glass, a subtle tremor in posture, all carrying weight, all communicating silently in a language of observation, judgment, and human dynamic, and I allowed myself a slow, steady breath, grounding in the thrill of autonomy, the quiet power of presence, the steady certainty of being awake, fully aware, fully alive, while the hall hummed with celebration, competition, hidden calculations, and the invisible choreography of perception and influence. And I felt the energy shift once more, subtle, deliberate, the quiet tension now rippling like a delicate current beneath the laughter, the music, the glow of candles and chandeliers, and I realized that the night had become a canvas of perception, awareness, subtle influence, and reclaimed agency, and I moved deliberately, sensing every nuance, every flicker, every silent adjustment in the network of relationships, fully engaged, fully awake, fully alive, savoring the quiet thrill of observation and the deliberate freedom of presence. And then I noticed her, the cousin whose competitiveness had shadowed me for years, and I saw her subtle recalibration, the brief flicker of surprise as she realized my refusal to be invisible had not only asserted my presence but had shifted the invisible balance. And I felt the thrill of quiet power tempered with vigilance, because every assertion of self invites response, observation, and adjustment, and I allowed awareness to guide me, breathing slowly, letting the pulse of presence coexist with the subtle tension, the quiet exhilaration, the steady, deliberate observation as the evening rippled with quiet revelation, hidden truths, subtle conflicts, micro-expressions and invisible shifts. And I knew that by refusing to vanish, by refusing to assume the expected role, by embracing autonomy and observation, I had created not only a space for myself, but a lens through which the subtle truths of the evening could be perceived, acknowledged, and navigated. And the thought pulsed through me with steady force that presence, awareness, observation, and autonomy were their own quiet form of rebellion, triumph, and liberation. And I felt that pulse, steady, insistent, exhilarating as the music softened further, the laughter quieted, the shadows lengthened, and the night wrapped the hall in golden warmth. And I knew deeply, fully, that this evening, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in experience, had been transformed, shaped, claimed, and lived fully because I chose to exist in it as myself, fully awake, fully aware, fully alive, and nothing, no expectation, no obligation, no invisible demand could take that from me. And the realization washed through me, calm and exhilarating, steady as a heartbeat as the night deepened, carrying the quiet certainty that autonomy, presence, and awareness were the truest forms of reclamation. And I let myself simply exist in that truth, fully awake, fully alive, fully myself. Please follow me for no reason.